Ethan stood at the toy counter with both hands trembling, counting every crumpled bill and coin he had collected over months of quiet sacrifice. Beside him, his 7-year-old daughter Lily pressed a folded advertisement against her chest, a glossy cutout of an angel doll with golden wings and a soft porcelain face, the kind of toy that lit up her eyes the moment she first saw it in a store window. There was exactly one box left on the shelf. The last one. Ethan's fingers shook as he slid the money across the counter. And for one brief, beautiful moment, the world felt like it was finally going to be kind to him. Then, a hand in a $1,000 watch reached past his daughter's shoulder and snatched the box from the display. The man attached to that hand didn't even look at Ethan when he spoke. He just smiled slow and cold and said the kind of thing that was designed not just to wound but to remind a man exactly where he stood. Within minutes, the entire wing of the shopping mall had gone completely silent. And the reason for that silence had nothing to do with the millionaire. It had everything to do with the elderly couple who had just walked back through the front door. Ethan Calloway had not always driven a delivery van through the dark side of midnight. There was a time, not so many years ago, when he came home before sunset, when dinner was already on the table, when a woman named Claire filled their small apartment with the kind of warm, unorganized noise that makes a house feel alive. Claire had been the sort of person who remembered everyone's birthday, who kept a ceramic jar of hard candies on the kitchen counter for no reason, other than that she liked the idea of sweetness being available at all times. She had been Lily's mother. She had been Ethan's whole anchor. The cancer had been fast and merciless, the way the worst things in life tend to be. And when it was over, Ethan found himself standing in a hospital corridor at 2 in the morning, holding a sleeping 3-year-old who had no idea that the world had just changed forever. He did not let himself fall apart. He understood, with the quiet certainty of a man who has no backup plan, that falling apart was not something he had the luxury of doing. So he held Lily tighter, drove home in the dark, and the next morning he got up and kept going. The delivery job was brutal in the way that invisible work is always brutal. Not dramatic, not cinematic, just relentless and unglamorous and bone-deep tired. He drove from 10 at night until 4 in the morning, hauling packages through neighborhoods that were either too wealthy to notice him or too desperate to care. He slept in the hours between Lily's school drop-off and his own shift prep, ate whatever was cheapest and fastest, and wore the same 4 shirts on rotation until the collars began to fray. He never complained about any of it. Complaining, in his mind, required an audience. And the only audience he had was a little girl who already carried more awareness of adult sadness than any child her age should. So he learned to keep his face neutral when he was tired, to make his voice bright when he was discouraged, and to laugh loudly and genuinely when Lily said something funny, because her laughter was the one thing in his life that cost nothing and gave back everything. She was, by any measure, an extraordinary child, not because she was gifted in any particular way, but because she was astonishingly kind. She shared her lunch with classmates who forgot theirs. She thanked the school janitor every single morning. She had never once, in all her 7 years, thrown a tantrum in a store or demanded something that Ethan couldn't afford, which was why, when her teacher sent home a note asking parents to bring a small birthday wish list for the class activity, Lily had written only one thing. Not a bicycle, not a gaming device, not the expensive craft set that half her classmates were circling in catalogs. She had written, in careful rounded letters, the angel doll from Brightland Toys. Just that. One item. One wish. And she had added, in smaller letters at the bottom, in parentheses, as if she understood the weight of asking, only if it's okay. Ethan had read that parenthetical and had to excuse himself to the bathroom for a few minutes. He stood at the sink with the water running so she wouldn't hear him, pressed both palms flat on the cold porcelain, and made himself a promise. The kind of promise that is not a casual intention but a contract signed in the private language of parenthood. He was going to get her that doll, whatever it took. He began that same night, sliding a mason jar to the back of the highest kitchen shelf and dropping into it every coin he received as change, every dollar bill left as a tip during late-night deliveries, every small windfall that crossed his path. He stopped buying coffee from the gas station kiosk and made his own in a battered thermos. He ate peanut butter on toast for lunch 4 days a week. He walked the 8 blocks to the grocery store instead of driving, saving the gas. He counted the jar every Sunday night at the kitchen table after Lily had gone to sleep, spreading the bills out flat and stacking the coins in small towers, and he would calculate quietly, without a calculator, how many more weeks he needed. Lily kept the folded advertisement under her pillow. Some mornings, Ethan would walk past her room and find her lying on her side, holding it against her cheek the way another child might hold a stuffed animal, already half in love with something she had never touched. The day finally came on a Thursday in early December, cold and bright, when the jar held enough. Ethan counted it 3 times to be sure. He laid it all out on the kitchen table, $47.60 in bills, $14.22 in coins, and it was enough. Barely, just barely enough, with a few coins to spare. He put it all in an envelope, zipped it into his jacket pocket, and told Lily that they were going on a special errand before her birthday weekend. She had held his hand all the way to the bus stop, chattering about the doll's wings, and whether they were soft or stiff, and whether the doll came with a name or whether she got to choose one herself. He told her she could choose any name she wanted. She thought about it very seriously for 2 entire bus stops, and then announced, "Margaret." He laughed. She explained, with complete gravity, that Margaret was a name that sounded like someone who kept promises. He looked at her profile against the cold bus window and thought that he was, without question, the luckiest unlucky man alive. Brightland Toys occupied the entire east wing of the Meridian Grand Shopping Center, which was the kind of retail cathedral that had been built to make ordinary people feel the specific, engineered weight of their own ordinariness. The mall itself was a monument to calculated luxury marble flooring that reflected the overhead chandeliers in long, rippling pools of light, pianist music drifting from speakers that were hidden artfully in the decorative columns, security personnel in pressed charcoal blazers who stood at intervals along the promenade with the practiced stillness of people paid to project authority without exerting it. Everything about the place was designed to communicate a single message. This space belongs to people who belong here. And if you're not sure whether that includes you, it probably. Ethan had never set foot inside the Meridian Grand before. He noticed the floor first, the way his worn work boots made a sound on it that felt inappropriate. A dull scuff against all that polished stone. He noticed the way a woman in a fur-trimmed coat glanced at his jacket and then looked away with the particular efficiency of someone who has trained themselves to unsee things that might require a response. He noticed Lily's eyes go wide at the ceiling, at the chandeliers, at the enormous Christmas tree that stood in the central atrium like something from a fairy tale. And he held her hand a little tighter and reminded himself why they were there. Brightland Toys was everything its window displays had promised: a vast, warm cavern of color and motion, every shelf stocked to the edge with the kind of merchandise that children dreamed about and parents calculated in silence. The lighting inside was golden and deliberate, the kind that made every product look slightly more magical than it was. There were staff members in bright green vests moving between the aisles, and a long glass counter at the front where the most premium items were displayed under soft spotlights. Ethan and Lily stood at the entrance for a moment, adjusting. He felt the looks before he saw them, that particular shift in the ambient attention of a room when someone walks in who does not match the room's expectations. A young woman behind the counter straightened slightly, not in welcome, but in assessment. A teenage boy stocking a shelf paused long enough to register their presence, and then resumed his work with the deliberate speed of someone communicating disinterest. Lily either didn't notice or chose not to, and she pulled Ethan toward the back wall where the angel dolls were displayed. Her footsteps fast and light and completely unashamed. He followed her, and he did not allow himself to look anywhere but forward. Somewhere near the entrance, moving slowly along the edge of the central display, an elderly couple paused. The woman, silver-haired, in a soft gray coat, smiled gently when she caught sight of Lily's eagerness. Her husband, a tall man with a carefully trimmed white beard and quiet, observant eyes, watched the little girl for a moment before gently steering his wife toward another aisle. Neither of them said anything. Neither of them was in any hurry. The angel doll was on the third shelf from the bottom, in a box with a clear front panel so you could see everything: the golden wings, the white dress with tiny pearl buttons, the closed eyes with their delicate painted lashes. There was one box remaining. One single box, sitting slightly forward of where the others had been, as if the shelf itself was offering it. Lily made a sound that was barely a word, something between a breath and a whisper, and pressed both hands flat against the box without picking it up. She looked at her father. He nodded. She looked back at the doll. He watched her face and felt something in his chest that had no name in any language he knew, something that was made entirely of love and grief and the particular exhaustion of a person who has been holding everything together for a very long time. He reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew the envelope. He asked the nearest sales associate, a young woman with a name tag that read Brittany, whether the price was still the same as listed online. Brittany looked at the envelope. She looked at Ethan. She looked at Lily. She said, in a tone that was not quite rude but was a long way from kind, that the price was $61.80, including tax. Ethan nodded. He began to count the money out on the glass counter, carefully, bill by bill, coin by coin, the way a person counts money when they know exactly how much they have and exactly how much they need. The store had gotten quieter, the way spaces do when a group of people are all pretending not to watch the same thing. Lily stood very still beside her father, her hands clasped in front of her. At one point she reached up and touched his arm and said, in a voice so soft it was almost inaudible, "If it's not enough, it's really okay, Daddy. We can come back another time." He didn't answer. He kept counting. 47, 50, 55, 60. He placed the last coins in a small, deliberate stack and looked up at Brittany. $61.80. Laid out across the glass counter in crumpled bills and stacked coins, every cent accounted for and earned through cold nights and skipped meals and 100 quiet decisions that nobody would ever know about. Brittany looked at the money for a moment longer than was necessary. Then she reached under the counter for a bag. It was not a gracious gesture. It was the gesture of someone performing a transaction they resented being part of. But she reached for the bag, and Ethan exhaled. And Lily's hand found his and squeezed it with her whole small fist. And for one perfect, fragile moment, everything was going to be fine. Then the bell above the store entrance chimed. And a different kind of energy walked in. Damian Cole was the sort of man who had stopped needing to announce his own importance years ago, because the people around him had learned to do it for him. He was 38. The CEO of Cole Capital Ventures, a man whose photograph appeared regularly in the business supplements of major newspapers, accompanied by words like aggressive and visionary and disruptive, none of which he had any objection to. He wore a charcoal suit that had been made specifically for him by a tailor in Milan, and the watch on his left wrist cost more than Ethan's van, his rent, and 6 months of groceries combined. He moved through the world with the unthinking ease of a person who had never once had to consider whether he had enough, whether he belonged, whether anyone was looking at him with judgment. 2 people moved with him, a young male assistant carrying a leather portfolio and a security guard built like a piece of architectural concrete, both of them maintaining the precise distance required to signal presence without obscuring the principle. Damien walked through the toy store, the way a man walks through a place he intends to own, which is to say, slowly, with his hands in his pockets, looking at things the way a person looks at objects rather than at experiences. He was not there for a child. He was there because his business partner's kid had a birthday party that weekend, and Damien had been reminded about it by his assistant 4 times, and had finally agreed to stop in and buy whatever was most expensive. He stopped at the angel doll display. He looked at the single remaining box on the shelf. He reached out and picked it up with one hand, the way you pick up something that already belongs to you. Ethan's voice was quiet and even. "Excuse me," he said. "We were just purchasing that." Damian Cole turned his head. He took in Ethan the worn jacket, the fraying collar, the hands still holding the carefully counted money on the counter with the unhurried, comprehensive efficiency of a man who was very practiced at reading a room, and had decided, before a single word was exchanged, exactly what this interaction was going to be. He smiled. Not warmly, not even neutrally. It was the smile of a man who had decided, in an instant, to make this into something. "Were you?" he said. It was not a question. Ethan kept his voice steady. "My daughter has been waiting for this doll for a long time. That's the last one. If you don't mind, we had it first." Lily stood beside her father and said nothing. She was looking at the floor. Damien glanced at her. Then he looked back at Ethan, with an expression that belonged on the face of someone who had just been mildly amused by a minor inconvenience. "Maybe," he said, his voice carrying the practiced, projecting ease of a man who was not worried about being overheard. "Someone should have taught her not to dream about things that are above her station." The words landed in the room like something dropped from a height. Nobody moved. Brittany, still holding the bag under the counter, stopped moving completely. The teenage boy in the aisle set down the product he was holding. Damien handed the box to his assistant and pulled a thick fold of bills from his jacket pocket. He peeled off several casually, the way another person might peel a receipt from a paper roll, and held them out toward Ethan, not to hand to him, to drop. They fell in a loose scatter across the counter, across the stacked coins, across the crumpled bills that Ethan had counted 3 times. "That should be enough for a week of groceries," Damien said. "Take your kid home." Lily made a small sound and pressed herself against her father's side. One of the bills drifted off the counter and floated to the floor. Then a coin followed it, rolling in a slow, wavering arc across the marble. Nobody moved to stop it. Ethan did not move. He stood very still, one hand on Lily's shoulder, and for a long moment, his jaw was tight and his eyes were flat, and he was clearly doing the very difficult thing of deciding what kind of man he was going to be in the next 30 seconds. Brittany, having entirely recalibrated her allegiances in the preceding 20 seconds, stepped back from the counter and looked at her manager, who had appeared in the doorway of a back office, taken in the scene, and made his own rapid calculation. The manager, a heavyset man named Gary, whose name tag announced him with the grim formality of an institutional document, walked to the counter and picked up the doll's box from the assistant's arms with the decisive movement of someone who had chosen a side. "Our VIP customers receive priority service," he said, addressing this to no one in particular and everyone in general. A second employee materialized beside him, nodding in corroboration of a policy that had been invented approximately 12 seconds ago. Ethan looked at Gary. Gary did not look back. Gary was already moving toward the register with the box, and the moment he started moving, a security guard in a mall blazer appeared at the store entrance, summoned by some signal Ethan hadn't seen, and stood in the doorway with his arms crossed and his face arranged into the expression of someone prepared to make a request that was not optional. Ethan picked up every bill and every coin from the counter. He picked them up slowly and carefully, placing each one back into the envelope. He did not hurry. He did not look at Damien Cole. When he had retrieved all of the money, all of it, including the bill from the floor and the coin that had rolled several feet away, he took Lily's hand and walked toward the exit. Lily did not cry. That was the thing that would stay with him longest afterward, that she did not cry. She walked beside him with her hand in his and her eyes on the floor. And just before they passed through the glass doors into the mall corridor, she looked up at him and said, with a small and careful brightness that was clearly assembled from the pieces of his own expression, "It's okay, Daddy. I don't really need the doll." He pushed through the door. He found a bench in the corridor, a few yards from the store entrance, and sat down, pulling her onto his lap, and held her without saying anything. She didn't cry. He didn't either. They just sat there, in the noise and warmth of the Meridian Grand, two people who had done everything right and arrived at the end of something anyway. The automatic doors of Brightland Toys opened a second time, and the elderly couple who had been moving quietly through the store emerged back into the main corridor. The woman whose name was Eleanor saw them first. She saw the little girl sitting on the bench, with her face pressed against her father's chest, and she saw the father's hand resting on the child's back, with the particular tension of someone absorbing a blow on behalf of someone else. She stopped walking. Her husband, whose name was Walter, stopped beside her and followed her gaze. He studied the scene for a moment with the calm, comprehensive attention of a man who had spent many decades reading situations. He looked at the father. He looked at the child. He looked back at the store entrance. "I know him," he said quietly. Eleanor turned to look at him. "The delivery man," Walter said. "The one who stopped for us on Route 12 last Tuesday." In the rain, Eleanor remembered, they had been returning from a dinner 40 miles outside the city, and a rear tire had gone flat on a 2-lane road, with no shoulder and no cell signal, and no other cars in either direction, for the better part of 20 minutes. Ethan had been driving his delivery van in the opposite direction, heading back from a late-night drop-off, and had pulled a U-turn without hesitating, parked behind them with his hazard lights on, and changed their tire in the pouring rain, using the spare from their own trunk. He had refused every attempt they made to pay him, refused their insistence, refused their card. He had just waved, gotten back in the van, and driven away. Walter had written the van's company number in his phone with a note beside it. Find out who that was. He had not yet made the call. He made a different one now. Eleanor walked to the bench and sat down beside Ethan with the unhurried ease of someone who has long since stopped worrying about whether she was welcome. She placed her hand over Lily's and said softly, "Hello, sweetheart." "Were you looking at the angel doll?" Lily lifted her face. She looked at this woman, the silver hair, the soft gray coat, the eyes that held something kind and very steady, and nodded. "My daddy had enough money," Lily said with the clear, factual tone of a child reporting an injustice she does not yet know how to frame. "A man took it." Eleanor did not say anything right away. She looked at Ethan, who met her eyes and offered nothing, no self-pity, no appeal. He was past the point of appealing to strangers. He was in the part of the experience where you just carry it and move on. She held his gaze for a moment and then stood up. And Walter, who had been speaking quietly on his phone a few feet away, ended his call and walked toward the store entrance. Ethan started to say something, some version of "it's fine, you don't need to," but Walter had already pushed through the doors. The energy inside Brightland Toys shifted the moment Walter Marsh walked back in. It was not dramatic. He did not raise his voice. He did not make any gesture that could have been categorized as threatening or confrontational. He simply stood in the entrance for a moment and looked around the store with the particular quality of attention that belongs to people who built the things other people are standing inside of. And then he walked to the main counter where Gary and Damien were completing their transaction. Gary was already holding the bag. The receipt was already printing. Damien had his phone out and was responding to a message with one thumb. Having concluded the episode in the toy store to his satisfaction, and moved on to the next item on his afternoon agenda, Walter stood in front of the counter and waited until Gary looked up. Gary looked up. Gary's face did several things in rapid succession. He said, "Mister," and then stopped. Walter said, quietly, "Who authorized the treatment of that customer outside?" Gary's mouth opened and then closed. Damien lowered his phone. He looked at this old man in his careful suit, and his white beard, and his unhurried posture. And he did what people like Damien Cole always do when confronted with something they haven't categorized yet. He performed indifference. "I'm sorry, do I know you?" he said. Walter looked at him with the particular expression of a person who has been asked that question before and has long since lost the capacity to find it interesting. "My name is Walter Marsh," he said. "My wife and I founded the Meridian Group in 1978. He paused, just long enough for that to land. "This shopping center, and the 43 others in the Meridian portfolio, are our properties. Brightland Toys is one of 11 retail brands we license, and you just publicly humiliated a man and a child in one of our stores." The silence that followed was not like ordinary silence. It was the silence of a room reconfiguring itself around a new set of facts. Gary had gone the color of old paper. The assistant standing next to Damien took a single step backward, as if creating physical distance from the situation. Two sales associates who had been nearby suddenly found reasons to be in other parts of the store. Damian Cole did not change color. Damian Cole had been in high-pressure negotiations and hostile boardrooms and 3 separate lawsuits, and he had trained himself over many years to maintain a surface of unruffleable composure. But something shifted behind his eyes, a recalculation, happening very fast in a mind built for recalculation, and when he spoke, the easy contempt was replaced by something slightly different, the controlled, managed tone of a man who has realized he needs to manage. "I think there's been a misunderstanding," he said. "I was simply making a purchase. I didn't do anything that wasn't entirely within my rights," as a Walter said. "Your rights." He said it simply, with no inflection, repeating the word the way you might repeat a word in a language you don't speak when you want to make sure you heard it correctly. He looked at Gary. Who sold this man the last item that was being purchased by another customer? Gary began to say something about VIP policy. Walter raised one hand, not in a sharp gesture but in the manner of a person who simply no longer needs more information from a particular direction. He took out his phone and made a call. The call lasted 45 seconds. Gary flinched at something Walter said during it. A single word, a name, a number, some reference point that Gary apparently recognized, and by the time Walter ended the call, the architecture of the interaction had completely changed. Eleanor had come back inside by this point, with Lily by the hand and Ethan a step behind, and she had positioned Lily just inside the entrance where the child could see but was not at the center of the storm. Walter returned to the counter and addressed Gary with a precision that was far more unsettling than anger would have been. "You are relieved of your management position, effective immediately. Someone from regional operations will be here within the hour to discuss the staff review." Gary said nothing. There was nothing to say. Damian Cole, who had been watching this with the expression of a man watching a mathematical proof, disprove something he had accepted as certain, now spoke up with more force. "Mr. Marsh, I understand your concern, but I am Damian Cole. I run Cole Capital Ventures. Your group has 3 active licensing agreements with my firm. I would strongly suggest—" Walter looked at him. It was a very specific look, the look of a man who has seen many Damian Coles in 40-some years of building things, and who has never once found them as impressive as they found themselves. "I know your firm," Walter said. "Those agreements are under review as of this afternoon." Damian's composure showed its first fracture, not visible in his face but in his posture, a slight forward shift, the body moving before the mind gives permission. "You can't, we already have," Walter said. "Your name is on a list that affects your access to every retail property in the Meridian portfolio. That list also goes to our partners. You might want to call your legal team." He turned away from Damian, as if turning away from a screen after the show has ended. He crossed the store to where Lily was standing with Eleanor. He crouched down slowly, the way older men crouch, with care and intention, and looked at her at eye level. "What's your name?" he asked. She said, "Lily." He said, "How old are you going to be, Lily?" She held up 7 fingers and said, "This many. On Saturday." He nodded very seriously. "Well," he said, "we have to do something about that." He stood up and said something to Eleanor that nobody else heard. Eleanor smiled. She took Lily's hand and walked with her back to the shelf where the last remaining angel doll box still sat because nobody had moved it, because nobody had done anything in the last several minutes, except stand very still and rearrange their understanding of the situation. Eleanor lifted the box from the shelf and carried it to the counter and set it down in front of a sales associate whose name was not Brittany, because Brittany had taken this opportunity to be on a break in the back room. The associate, a young man whose name tag read Marcus, who had watched the entire episode and done nothing, but who was now doing everything with tremendous efficiency and goodwill, began processing the purchase at a speed that suggested he understood the stakes of being visibly competent in this particular moment. Ethan had not moved from just inside the entrance. He stood with his hands at his sides and watched what was happening, and could not entirely organize his thoughts into a coherent response to it. Walter came to stand beside him. "You're the man who changed our tire," he said. It was not a question. Ethan looked at him. Route 12, Ethan said. The blue sedan. Walter nodded. You wouldn't take any money. Ethan shrugged, slightly. You didn't need to give me any. It was raining. You needed a tire changed. Walter was quiet for a moment. Then he said, You came here today for your daughter. Ethan said, It's her birthday. Walter looked at Lily, standing at the counter with Eleanor and Marcus, watching with enormous eyes as the doll was carefully placed in a bag with tissue paper. He looked back at Ethan. He said, You came here with everything you had. Ethan said nothing. He looked at the floor for a moment, and then looked up, and whatever was in his face in that moment was not self-pity, and not anger, and not any of the things that a man in his situation might be expected to perform. It was just honesty, plain, unadorned, costly honesty. Walter looked at it and recognized it the way you recognize a thing you have not seen in a long time but have never forgotten. Eleanor brought the bag to Lily, and then did something unexpected. She crouched down beside the little girl and drew from her coat pocket a small folded card with handwriting on the inside, and she whispered something to Lily as she placed the bag in her hands. Lily received the bag with the careful solemnity of someone being handed something precious. And then she looked inside, and her face did the thing that a child's face does when it receives exactly what it wanted, not the explosive, performed excitement of a child in a commercial, but the quiet, private, real kind, the kind where a person goes very still for a moment before they can move again, because the feeling is too large to immediately translate into action. She looked at the doll through the clear front panel of the box and said, barely above a whisper, Margaret. Ethan heard it from across the room. He pressed his hand over his mouth and looked away for a moment. Eleanor stood and walked to his side. She has your eyes, she said softly. He nodded, not trusting his voice. She said, there's something we'd like to do, if you'll allow it. What followed happened quickly and with a quiet, purposeful energy that carried none of the drama of the preceding hour. Walter spoke to Marcus and 2 other staff members. A phone call was made. A small folding table was produced from the back of the store and placed near the window display, covered with a paper tablecloth. A box of birthday candles was located. Marcus disappeared into the back and returned with a grocery store cupcake, a single chocolate cupcake with white frosting, the kind the mall bakery kept for staff celebrations, and placed it on the table with a single candle pressed into the center. An older woman who worked in the stockroom and had apparently been watching through a door crack the entire time emerged and contributed a small foil banner from her own locker that said, Happy Birthday in silver letters, which she taped to the edge of the shelf without being asked. Lily looked at the table, and then looked at her father, and then looked at Eleanor and said, Is this for me? Eleanor said, Yes, sweetheart. It is absolutely for you. A few other shoppers had drifted close, drawn by the warmth of the scene rather than its drama, and they stood at a respectful distance and watched. Walter lit the candle with a lighter he produced from his jacket pocket. Lily stood in front of the table in her winter coat, holding her box with one arm, the doll's golden wings visible through the panel, and she closed her eyes and she wished for something. Nobody asked her afterward what it was. Damian Cole had not left. He was standing near the register with his assistant. His composure reassembled into something that looked like indignation and was probably closer to fear, watching the birthday scene with the particular discomfort of a man who has created a situation that has produced an outcome that cannot be corrected by spending money or deploying lawyers. He had made 2 phone calls in the last 15 minutes. One of them had confirmed that the Meridian Group's legal team had indeed placed a preliminary review notice on his firm's licensing agreements. The second had been to his own attorney, who had advised him to say nothing further. He was very much saying nothing further. He was also, for the first time in longer than he could clearly remember, standing in a room where nobody was looking at him for guidance or approval or permission, where nobody was managing the temperature of the air around him, where the thing that was happening entirely without reference to his presence or his importance or his money, and that experience, that specific, unfamiliar, complete absence of relevance, was doing something to the architecture of his certainty that he did not yet have words for, but that he could feel the shape of, standing there in his $1,000 suit, watching a little girl in a winter coat blow out a birthday candle. Ethan sat beside Lily at the small table while she ate the cupcake with both hands, and described in precise detail every aspect of the doll she had decided to name Margaret: the wings, the pearl buttons, the fact that Margaret's eyes were closed because she was dreaming about something good. Walter sat across from them and listened with what appeared to be genuine and unhurried attention. Eleanor had placed her hand on Ethan's arm at some point and left it there. After a while, Ethan looked at her and said, "I don't understand why you're doing this." Eleanor said, "We had a granddaughter." She said it simply, the way people say things that have been carried for a long time. Her name was Sophie. She would have been 8 this year. There was a pause. Lily looked up from the cupcake, reading the room with the instinctive attunement of a child who has grown up in the presence of adult emotion. She looked at Eleanor, and then at her father, and then back at Eleanor, and she slid off her chair and walked around the table and stood beside Eleanor and took her hand. Nobody had told her to do this. Eleanor looked down at Lily's hand in hers and was quiet for a moment. And when she looked up, her eyes were bright, but her expression was composed, the expression of a person who has learned to hold grief and gratitude in the same space without letting either one collapse. Walter looked at his wife and then at Lily and said, "There's one more thing we want to do." He called Marcus over and gave him a series of instructions that Marcus relayed to someone on his phone with the rapid precision of a person who recognized that these instructions were not suggestions. By the end of the week, not after a long review process, not pending board approval, not subject to committee consideration, but by the end of the actual calendar week, a corner of Brightland toys near the window had been reorganized and designated with a small hand-lettered sign that Eleanor made herself. The sign read Lily's Corner, and beneath it, in smaller letters, "For every child who deserves something wonderful." The corner was stocked with a rotating selection of toys, sourced through a fund that Walter set up with the legal efficiency of a man who had been creating corporate structures for half a century available at no charge, children from households verified through the local family resource center as experiencing financial hardship. It was not a grand gesture performed for an audience. It was a practical, permanent thing, organized quietly and maintained consistently, the kind of institutional kindness that does not expire when the news cycle moves on. Ethan was informed of it on Friday afternoon, when Marcus called him on the number Eleanor had taken the liberty of requesting. He sat in the driver's seat of his van in a parking lot after his shift and listened to what Marcus told him. And when the call ended, he sat there for a long time without starting the engine, looking at nothing in particular, feeling the particular quality of exhaustion that comes not from being worn down, but from being held up by something unexpected. The video shot on a phone by a shopper who had been in the store during the incident, and who had, to their credit, shared it without commentary, without sensational framing, simply as a record of what had happened, spread in the way that such things spread when they capture something in the ambient temperature of what people are feeling. It showed Damian Cole taking the box from the display. It showed the money on the counter. It showed the bills being dropped. It showed the coin rolling across the floor. It showed Lily's face for only a moment, a detail that the person who shot it had been careful about, blurring the image slightly before posting, but even that partial view was enough to communicate everything that needed to be communicated. It was shared widely and earnestly, and without the mean-spirited satisfaction that sometimes attaches itself to these things, because the people sharing it were mostly responding not to Damian's downfall, but to Ethan's dignity, to the specific quality of stillness in his face, when he turned and led his daughter out of the store, without a single word of self-defense. The business press picked it up within 48 hours, framing it initially as a PR problem for Cole Capital Ventures. Then the former employees began to talk, not in an organized way, not as a coordinated campaign, but in the individual, unconnected way that people talk when they have been waiting for the moment when talking becomes safe. 3 of them gave interviews. 1 filed a formal complaint with the labor board. The narrative that assembled itself from these pieces was consistent. A man who had built his reputation on the language of visionary leadership and who had practiced, in the private interior of his business, a contempt for anyone he perceived as beneath him that was structural, habitual, and long-standing. Damian Cole issued a statement through his communications team. The statement used the word misunderstanding 3 times, which was 3 times more than any version of a sincere apology would have required. His board of directors released their own statement, 11 days after the incident, announcing that Damian would be stepping back from his operational role pending a governance review. The Meridian Group's notice of license termination was formalized in writing on that same morning. Ethan did not watch any of this unfold in real time, because he was, as usual, working nights and sleeping mornings, and managing the logistics of a life that did not pause to accommodate outside events. He heard about pieces of it from his neighbor, from a coworker who drove the adjacent route, from Lily's teacher who stopped him at pickup one afternoon with the bright, urgent energy of someone carrying news they couldn't quite contain. He absorbed each piece of information the way a person absorbs information about a storm that has already passed with interest, but without the visceral engagement of someone who is still inside it. His name had appeared in several articles. He had not given any interviews. A reporter had called twice. He had not returned the calls, not from indifference, but because there was nothing he felt compelled to add to a story that had already been told more completely than he could have told it himself. What mattered, in the space of his actual life, was simpler than any of the external narrative. He had his daughter. He had his work. He had the knowledge that something Walter and Eleanor had set in motion would outlast the news cycle and would matter to children he would never meet. And he had a doll named Margaret, sitting on the shelf above Lily's bed, wings catching the morning light through the thin curtains, closed eyes, dreaming of something good. The birthday party was small. It happened on a Saturday afternoon in the front room of Ethan and Lily's apartment, with 4 of Lily's classmates and their parents, and balloons that Ethan had blown up himself the night before, and a cake from the bakery 2 blocks away that was inexpertly decorated with purple frosting and spelled Lily's name with one L, which Lily found hilarious. Walter and Eleanor had called the day before to ask whether they might stop by for a few minutes. They came with a paper bag, arrived at 2 o'clock, stayed for 45 minutes, and spent most of those minutes on the floor, playing a card game with Lily and her friends with the unself-conscious ease of people who have always known how to be present inside a moment rather than observing it from outside. When they left, Walter shook Ethan's hand at the door. The handshake lasted a moment longer than necessary, the kind of handshake that is not ending a visit but acknowledging something that doesn't have a clean name. Eleanor hugged Lily and said something in her ear. Lily nodded solemnly and then grinned. On the way down the stairs, Eleanor slipped her hand into Walter's, and they walked out of the building together into the December cold, and neither of them spoke for a while, and neither of them needed to. Ethan stood at the kitchen window after the last guests had gone, and Lily was asleep in the next room, with Margaret held against her chest, the doll's golden wings folded carefully over Lily's arm. The city was doing what cities do at 9 o'clock on a December evening, moving and glowing and insisting on itself, indifferent to any particular life being lived within it. He thought about the mason jar, now empty on the kitchen shelf. He thought about the coin that had rolled across the floor of Brightland Toys. He thought about Lily saying Margaret is a name for someone who keeps promises. He thought about Eleanor's hand on his arm, and the steadiness in her eyes, and the specific courage of a person who has lost something irreplaceable and chosen to keep showing up for the world anyway. He thought about Walter, an old man crouching down to be at eye level with a 7-year-old, asking her name with complete and genuine interest. He did not think about Damian Cole for more than a moment. And when he did, it was without anger. Anger required a sustained attention he no longer wanted to give to that particular direction. He had spent too many nights in a delivery van working his way through the dark, and he understood by now, in a way that was not naive but was genuinely earned, that the dark was not the last word on anything. The last word, if there was one, belonged to the small things. The coin. The paper advertisement under a pillow. The name chosen with such gravity at a bus stop. The candle blown out with eyes shut, the corner of a toy store with a hand-lettered sign. The birthday cake with the misspelled name that made a little girl laugh. He turned off the kitchen light and walked down the hall and stood in the doorway of Lily's room for a minute, watching her sleep. She had one arm around Margaret, and one arm thrown out across the pillow, her face completely relaxed in the specific, total way that children's faces relax in sleep, as if they know at some cellular level that they are held. He leaned against the doorframe and looked at her. A real gift is not measured in dollars or in the distance traveled to acquire it. It is not measured in the sacrifice it required, or the obstacles it overcame, or the injustices it outlasted, though it may have required all of those things. A real gift is measured in one direction only, by the love that stood behind it. Steady and patient, and refusing to be turned aside, long before anyone else could see what it was becoming. Ethan looked at his daughter and understood this not as a sentiment, but as a fact, the kind of fact that you don't learn from being told it, but from living through the proof of it, night by night, dollar by dollar, mile by mile, through all the ways the world tells you to stop, and all the smaller, quieter, more persistent ways the heart says no. He pushed off the doorframe and went to his own room. He had a shift in 5 hours. He set his alarm and lay down in the dark, and was asleep before the city outside his window could finish whatever sentence it was in the middle of. On the shelf above Lily's bed, Margaret's wings caught the small light from the hall and held it softly, the way good things hold light, not to keep it, but to give it back in a form that is gentler than it arrived.